Welcome to Renegade News Live. Today we're discussing the difference between open source software and free software, and why as a business owner you should care about that difference, and why yes, it's a little geeky, and yes, it's a little philosophical, but it's more of a discussion that normally tech firms get into, programmers really get into it quite often. But as a business owner, I think it's important for you to understand the differences as well. Because if you want to create a truly cancel-proof business, it's vital that you own your own assets. That's something we talk about quite a bit when we're talking about building a business that's cancel-proof. When you're relying on other people's platforms, whether that be social media platforms, whether that be hosting platforms, email system platforms, automation system platforms, even payment platforms. PayPal is now fining people $1,200 if they disagree with your opinion, or if they disagree with your facts because it disagrees with their opinions. They'll actually fine you $1,200, calling what you have misinformation. So having a truly cancel-proof business means building platforms that are things that you truly own and that you truly have control over. Because if you don't, you can be canceled anytime, and for any reason. So once you start to go down this road of owning your own platform and owning your own systems, one of the things that you're going to run into quite a lot is the terms open source software. You'll probably hear that a lot more often, but also also free software. And a lot of times those two terms, they overlap quite a bit, but there actually is a big difference. And that difference is somewhat philosophical, but it is a very important distinction. So let's talk kind of specifically about some platforms like, ActiveCampaign, Keep, GetResponse. Google Suite is another one. Google Suite can cancel you. If you have a document that talks about something that Google doesn't agree with, or they consider as misinformation, they can actually cancel your entire Google account. I don't know if most people read those terms of services, but that's actually in there that they can cancel you. ActiveCampaign, they've done it for cryptocurrency. Sometimes you can get away with it, but at their discretion, they can cancel you anytime. So that really sent me down this rabbit hole as I start to look at ways of owning your own automation. And we're going to be talking about a lot of those things, and owning your own mailing list and owning your own platform in general. In other videos, we're going to be talking about that. In other lives, we'll be talking about a lot of those real specifics tools that we're actually using. But as I went down that rabbit hole myself, I came across that term open source a lot, or I started looking into open source. I knew what open source was, and open source just made a sense because it's a way you can set up software for free on your own servers and have complete control over it. Now, back when I was working at Microsoft, too long ago to actually mention, I don't even know how many years ago that was, but open source, we used to talk about open source, and Microsoft does use some open source software. And what open source software is it's software that's developed by a community that you can use in your own projects, or you can use as is, and you can use that software completely free. So at Microsoft, we kind of scoffed at it a little bit, Microsoft being this big, pro-capitalism business, and everything has to be secret and everything has to be proprietary, and non-disclosure agreements had to be signed, all these things that we had to sign, and go on and on, reams of paperwork. If you quit, you can't talk to anybody else about what we did there, all those types of things. It was like working for the CIA. You had to be completely private about everything. Whereas open source, anybody can look at the software. Anybody can open up the source code and actually look at the source code. Generally speaking, it's free, although it's not entirely always the case, and that's something we're going to talk about in our discussion today. But you can actually look at that source code. You can then modify it to fit your needs. And by having that ability, you now have the ability to build systems that work the way that you want them to. And that makes it extremely powerful and extremely popular for agencies like us who like to build our own systems, like to build systems and platforms that are completely cancel-proof. But one of the things that I thought was, when I first heard of free software and first heard of open source software, was that they were the same thing. And what I've come to realize is they're actually very, very different. And it's really come down to a philosophical reason as to why those things are different, why those two platforms, those two methodologies, those two movements, essentially, why they're different, what's different about them. So with open source, actually, let's back up a step. Let's talk about free software and the free software movement. The free software movement was launched basically in 1983, or first started being discussed in around 1983, and then it came out with its first big launch in 1984. With that launch being in an operating system called Linux that was free and open to the world. And the idea behind it was basically freedom. It was really about people being free to own their software, to use their software, to be able to use the tools in the way that they want to use them. But it had this overarching theme of free in the sense of freedom. So when you look at the word free, let's get into semantics a little bit. I was going to talk about this later, but let's talk about semantics just a bit first. So with free software, you can really take that two ways. You can take that to mean, if you look at like free speech, for example. So there's free speech and there's also free beer, two very different things. One talks about freedom and the freedom to do what you want, the freedom to live the way you want, freedom in society. So that's what freedom of speech is, what free speech is. Whereas free beer means you get the beer for free. With free software and the free software movement, it's both. You're really going to get free software. It is free, so you do get it just like the free beer. But there's this underlying philosophy behind it where it's about making people free and making the software free to use, free to modify, but also free in the sense of a societal freedom and driving that whole concept of society being free. And that's a really big, important difference between the two. Because if you look at the open source community, it has a completely different goal. The open source movement kind of broke away from the free software movement in 1998. And it had a completely different philosophy. And that philosophy is a lot of the reason, or really the main reason, that they broke apart. So if you look at the open source movement right now, well, there's a lot of members who are in the open source movement who believe in freedom. They almost always get drowned out by that other faction of the open source movement. And this is where I really encountered it, where I was looking at free software and I was looking at open source software as a solution for my clients to find more freedom, to be able to own their own platforms, to become cancel proof, to really not have the limitations that cancel culture and just business in general has put on us, to give more freedom, more privacy, those types of things that we all find really important. And that's where I sort of found the open source. And to me, the open source software movement just made sense to fit that whole mold. But what I began to realize as I started to work with tools and I started to look at the different things that were available to me to work with and people in that open source movement that I've had discussions with, I realized that there was a lot of people there and a lot of companies and a lot of community members that didn't share my views on freedom at all. They believed in censorship, or their platforms were extremely strict in how you could use them. Yes, you could get them for free. Yes, the source code was open. I could read the source code. That wasn't an issue. But the philosophy was almost the antithesis of freedom in the way that I see it, in societal freedom. And to me, that the ideas seemed almost, I remember having a discussion. I was having a discussion with one of the guys that I work with, Nick, here, and I was saying, like, I don't understand how you can believe in this open source, but not believe in freedom, and how it was almost the conversation kind of went down the road of ANCAPs or anarcho-capitalists versus anarcho-communists, where as an anarcho-capitalist and a communist have very different views, and anarcho-capitalists are very free thinking and very open. Anarcho-communists almost lean towards, well, do lean towards more of an authoritarian type of rule. And I want to get into a philosophical discussion about that right here, because that's not what we're here for. But I almost saw that same type of attitude, that kind of controlling attitude, I guess. Almost, I don't want to call it communism, but that's almost where it felt. That, like, it felt close enough that that's where our conversation went. And it's as I started to do research and going down that road, where it didn't really make sense to me was I realized that the open source movement didn't care about the right and wrong of the societal impact. Societal impact doesn't come into that decision or into that movement or into come into that philosophy at all. They're all about the tools and making the tools have open source code so you can read the source code, and having community contributions so that source code can be modified and improved, and the tools can be modified and improved. But all their decisions, all of their philosophy is around the actual code, the technical implementation of that code. And they don't have any type of concept of right or wrong within the societal impact of that software. Whereas the free software movement, they are very cognizant of the freedom aspect. Again, getting back to the freedom of speech and the free beer, open source is your free beer. You can get it for free. You can use it. You can look at under the hose. But the free software movement is more about the freedom of society and the free attitude and that freedom of speech. That whole liberty is core to the belief of that movement. And so they're really promoting the freedom of society by actually using their software. And that's where it becomes a really vital piece and a vital part of our company and our company culture as we move forward. And as we're looking for tools, and as we're expanding our company, expanding how we work with our clients, expanding how we work with society and bring on the free society that we're working for, our business has really been changing. Like, we're focusing a lot on building cancel-proof businesses because we want to enable creators and influencers who are making the world a better place through more freedom and for more liberty. And where we're in this place right now where freedom and liberty are being suppressed and silenced, we're getting these draconian rules, and censorship from big tech is playing such a huge role in our lives in general. You have to walk like you're on eggshells to avoid getting canceled and losing your entire business. Big tech is driving society because they have the power to do so through their monopolies and through their major central power structure the big tech has. They're able to mold society in the way that they want to because they're silencing any dissenting views. Free software and our company, using that free software and our philosophy in general, aims to push against that. So our internal company culture and the free software movement and the free software foundation align in that model so much that it's allowed us to kind of change our own internal values and how we look at things. So I heard this great quote, and I think this really summarizes kind of everything, the big difference between the two, between open source and the free software movement. And I think that quote kind of really encapsulates everything, I think. It says that a pure open source enthusiast, one that is not at all influenced by the ideals of free software, will say, I'm surprised that you were able to make this program work so well without using our development model. So they're all about the development model. But you did make it work. How can I get a copy? So that attitude rewards schemes that take away our freedom. And that leads to our loss because they're supporting software, even if they don't generally support, more controls, or maybe they are freedom thinking. By using that philosophy or taking that open source philosophy, they're actually taking away our freedom by supporting businesses that want to take away our freedoms. Whereas a free software activist is going to say, your program is very attractive, but I value my freedom more. So I reject your program. I will get my work done in some other way and support a project to develop a free replacement. If we value our freedom, we can act to maintain and defend it. And I think that, that just sums up everything. And like I said, that one line really has changed our company and how our company does business, how our company chooses tools, how our company chooses platforms. If there is a free software tool available to us, we're going to use that free software. Not because it's free, not because it doesn't cost anything. There's plenty of open source that we can use for free. There's plenty of commercial tools that we use probably for cheaper, because with free software, even though it's free, you generally end up paying for things like services, like getting it installed. You have to pay for developers. So there are costs involved. I'll talk about that maybe in some other discussion, how there's actually money to be made in both open source and free software. I guess quickly to go down that road, just as a side rant a little bit. The way you make money in both free software and in open source software is through using that software and adding on services. So for example, free software that we use a lot is called Mautic, and we use that for automation. Now, so in that regard, it's a replacement for, say, ActiveCampaign. And ActiveCampaign, obviously you pay for, whereas Mautic, you can actually get completely free. So as I was looking at it, and I was looking at different Mautic things, I'm like, well, how are these guys making money? Like, how does this actually work? And I had an understanding of it, but the way that they make money is by helping you to utilize it, for example. So if you don't have a technical person in your company, you probably won't be able to get Mautic installed and maintained on your own. It's a little bit more complicated. It's not quite as user-friendly. Because you actually own it, it goes on your own servers. You're not actually hosting it on a cloud like you would be with ActiveCampaign. With ActiveCampaign, you sign into their website and you just use their automation. With Mautic, if you install the free software, the open source version, you have to put it on your server, you have to install it, you have to maintain it. However, as a company, as an agency, I can put it on my cloud hosting service, set that all up. I have to hire IT people to do that, and programmers and developers to actually develop that software. But now if you want to work on my cloud host, I can actually bill you for that as a service. Now you're paying for actually using the service. So that's how the monetization model works on those two. So I don't really want to get into that too deeply, but I did want to mention that both of these models do support capitalism and do support for-profit. They're not completely, while they're both community driven and the community part of it is vital, they're not completely driven by altruism. There is a way to profit from these. So anyway, so that's, now as I went on that side track, I kind of lost my train of thought of where I was going there. But because of this difference, it really puts a filter on how our company chooses the software that we work with. We've decided to only work with free software when it's available. Like I said, not because it's free, because it's not free. By using it, we're going to have to hire extra developers, extra IT teams. We have to do these things. So we're not doing it because it's free or because it's a free model, but because we believe in the philosophy behind it, because we believe in owning our own platforms, because we want the ability to not be put in a box. I mean, that's the other thing that both open source and free software give you, is the ability to not have to work in the ways that these companies dictate that you're going to work. By using the software, you can modify it the way that you want. You can model it to work the way that you want it as a company. There's so much more flexibility. So you have complete freedom in how you use it, as well as promoting freedom because you now own the system that's on your own server. So you have that freedom, but you also have freedom from the working standpoint. You have freedom from all different angles to actually use the software the way you want, to actually speak the things you want to speak, which is obviously the big one for us, to be able to own that message that you're trying to put out to the world. And that's why we use both. That's why it was the ownership, but that's why we also want to support as a company the free software movement and the Free Software Foundation, because we agree with that entire philosophy. And just because we're capitalists and we believe in profit doesn't mean that we have to work in this bubble of non-disclosure agreements and keeping everything secret. We can actually be a part of a community. And that's what we wanted to drive. I mean, that's always been part of our mission, is driving this movement of entrepreneurs who are making a better world by spreading the message of freedom. And by working together in this movement, that's how we can move mountains. And that's become such a central part of our platform and such a central part of our business, because we can't do it on our own. I mean, we are all activists, but we're not going to move mountains on our own. But by enabling other creators and influencers and experts to be able to drive that message forward, we're now all working together. We're working within this. We talk about a lot about the parallel economy with crypto, and with all of us freedom lovers working in a parallel community together to push against that establishment that's trying to keep us down, who's trying to really stifle our words, stifle our lives, keep us entrapped. And I don't want to get too far into those weeds today either, but the free software movement and the Free Software Foundation becomes a part of that movement. And that's why, as a business, we think that it's so vital, as your business looks at providers you work with, at tools you use, that you at least look into the free alternatives, because the free alternatives are the ones that will help push this parallel economy and this freedom movement forward. And that's really why we become such a staunch supporter of about the free software movement, and why it's vital that we think that everybody understands the difference between free software and open source software, because the difference really comes down to that philosophical separation between freedom and not caring about freedom. So if you look at free software, all open source software is free software. Or sorry, let me put that another way. All free software is open source. It kind of fits into that model of open source. So if you have the open source model, generally everything that's in the free software movement fits into that. However, not all open source fits into the free software model. And that's why using that software that isn't part of it, or using commercial off-the-shelf software, you're actually fighting against freedom, and why it's so important. So that's really all I want to talk about today. It was a little bit of a rant, a little bit off the hip. I didn't want to, like I said, we have a big announcements coming this week, so you want to be watching for that coming out very soon. We're really, really excited about that. We're going to be back on tomorrow. I don't know what the topic was. I did have the topic beside me here, and I'm drawing a blank on what it was. But we're going to be talking more about building virtual summits, building cancel-proof businesses, and how our system kind of works to actually build a much freer business. So we'll see you tomorrow here on Renegade News Live.